Hello, my name is Bob German, and I'm a partner technical architect for the US One Commercial Partner team at Microsoft. Welcome to the webinar, Building End-to-End Solutions Using SharePoint Framework in Microsoft Teams. So what we're going to cover here today is really an overview of how to build an application in Teams that runs in a Teams tab using the SharePoint framework. I'm not going to get into every detail of how to program the SharePoint framework, but instead kind of give you some high points of things that you're going to want to do once you get that project going, such as calling the Teams Client SDK, the Graph API, the SharePoint API, custom web services, everything that you would need to build an end-to-end scenario. Also going to show you how to post into the Teams channel and link deep links from the Teams channel back into your tab so that you can integrate the conversational aspect of Teams into your SharePoint framework solution. Finally, I'll point out some resources and talk about the community a little bit. So here's the things that I'm not going to cover, and you may want to refer to this list after the session, so I'll repeat this at the end. But basically the left column is tooling up. So these are all resources for example, learning TypeScript, which is the language that's used in SharePoint Framework, Webpack, which is the module and bundle system, etc. So that's on the left, and then on the right column, there are several tutorials, including how to start from scratch, setting up your development environment, building your first web part, and a tab in Teams ends up being just a big web part in the SharePoint framework. There are labs for both Teams and SharePoint. There's a walkthrough that shows you how to get through building a brand new SharePoint framework web part and bringing that into a Teams application. So there's a lot of information here that you can go through afterwards, as well as the code from this webinar is all available for you. So you can definitely check that out and not need to try to remember the exact lines of code and that sort of thing as we go. So let's start with a little bit of an architecture overview. And this may be a review for some of you because I know there are a lot of other places where this information is available. On the left, you can see all the different things that you can put into your app for Microsoft Teams. The funny little secret is that none of these apps actually run, none of these aspects actually run in Microsoft Teams. It's all kind of an illusion. They actually run outside of Teams in other web services and web pages that could be anywhere on the internet. And Teams cleverly stitches them together into a user interface so that the user sees everything in context and everything together under one pane of glass. But in reality, the different assets that you're seeing on the screen could be all over the place. So the commonality, really all that a Teams app is a manifest file. It's a JSON file that has pointers that tells Teams where is this tab, where is this bot, right? The bot is just a web service. The tab is just a web page. Connectors send information into a Teams channel. You can reference that from your Teams manifest, etc. So everything inside of the Teams application is just really a manifest telling Teams where to get the application assets that it needs, and then a couple of icons that get displayed inside of Teams. All that is zipped up into a zip file and uploaded into Teams or published out on in the storefront. So those are your options. There's a link here to an article that goes a little bit more deeply into that. What's now introduced is the ability for tabs to not just run outside of Teams, but to run inside of SharePoint. So every team, as you probably know, has an Office 365 group associated with it. And every Office 365 group has a SharePoint site. So why stand up an extra web server or web service or app service to host that web page when you've already got one? SharePoint is already there, and it's already guaranteed to be there for every team. The permissions are set consistently. It's a perfect place to host that tab. The way I usually look at this is that if you have an existing web page maybe you're an ISV and you already have a service out there in the world, then you're probably going to want to just use the model on the left. Host your web page, declare it inside the manifest. There's some things you have to do about authentication because you're running in an iframe. But by and large, you should be able to reuse almost all of your existing web assets inside of a Teams application. If, on the other hand, you're working inside of an enterprise or you're starting a greenfield project, why worry about where to host that when you've already got SharePoint? The SharePoint framework is is usually a better choice inside of an enterprise where you know you're guaranteed to have that SharePoint site. So inside of there, we have the modern team site. Inside of every modern team site, there's a special page called teamshostedapp.aspx, which will host the web part that you write for SharePoint Framework. It will fill the entire screen. Teams will host that inside of an iframe inside of your tab. Now, if you do the walkthrough, you're going to find out that there's really two manifests that you have to think about here and two packages. This may change in the future, but right now there are two parts to it. There's the SharePoint Framework Solution Package, which has a SharePoint manifest telling it about the web part, and optionally, the JavaScript that makes the web part work is inside of there. So everything in SharePoint Framework runs in the web browser. So it's all client-side code, and that JavaScript bundle that gets compiled from the TypeScript can actually be included right inside of that SharePoint package file. It's really a zip file. If you want to see what's inside, take one, rename it to endin.zip. You can open it up and look inside, right? Then the Teams app references the SharePoint app. What's kind of nice about this is that you could actually update the SharePoint app, and all of the Teams apps that use it will inherit that update. So it's kind of nice if you were using a particular solution in a whole bunch of different teams around an organization. So let me show an example. So here's a little sample web part that I'm going to be using and drawing code from throughout today. The scenario is that I have a team of insurance adjusters. This really could be anybody who goes on site and works with customers. And this team actually, they all work together and help each other out when they have challenges. They're looking at building damage, they're assessing and appraising new construction, everything that an insurance agent or insurance adjuster would need to do on site. The way that we've modeled this is that a group of these folks are in a team, and they're collaborating together, and they often need to help each other out. You might need an expert in a certain type of construction, that sort of thing. And so their on-site field visits are actually all tracked inside of the calendar that's associated with that team, and they're all channel meetings. So you'll see the organizer of this one was Tony Smith, but adjusters, which is the team itself, is actually one of the attendees. That basically puts the team right into the channel. Similarly, this other one, I'm the organizer, and again, the attendee of adjusters is there to make this into a channel meeting. Now, these are actually stored in the calendar, which is in Exchange Online. It's part of that Office 365 group again. So one of the things here is that we didn't have to write any code to make this happen, to allow people to see these meetings that are in the channel and to join each other's meetings is all there automatically. But it can become a little bit cumbersome in this case. I've got a group of several different adjusters, and they're all running around, and I don't have a ton of test data, but in the real world, it would be kind of an overwhelming amount. So I wrote this tab. Let me show you the tab in SharePoint. So if we go into the team and click Open in SharePoint, the SharePoint site that's associated with that team, notice if you look at the URL, it has the same name, sites/adjusters, right? It brings me to the file page, but if I click on Home, it'll bring me to the home page, and I've placed the web part on that home page. So what this web part does is it looks at that calendar and it rolls up everybody's calendar, divides it into different tabs, and then if I click on one of the appointments, it actually goes and gathers all the information I might need. There's some activities that are just kind of payments and other information from a line of business system that's currently mocked up. There's nothing really there right now. Documents is not mocked up. These are documents that are actually in the SharePoint site. The weather is real. The location of the photo in the lower left is real. That's in SharePoint. Where the weather, again, on the right is coming from Open Weather Maps. The big cheese, that's coming from the little name and address portion, and the contact is coming from the Northwind database. Then there's a box where I can post to the channel, and below that is a Bing map showing the actual location from Northwind plotted on a map. So it's all pretty realistic stuff. And the idea here is that I could get all the information I need about one of these insurance adjuster visits in one place. I can also see what my teammates are doing, so I can come in here and see what Katie's got going on. And if she wants some help, I can actually get all the information about one of her engagements just with one click. Now, if I edit this web part, it's just a web part. So if I edit it, you'll see that there's a few fields that I'm gathering over here on the left. When it runs in SharePoint, this web part requires to know what group name is, what the group ID is, so that it can get to that mailbox, and what the channel ID is, so that we can post into that channel. And you'll see the code during the walkthroughs that does a lot of this. Now, when it's running in Teams, we don't really need to configure any of this information. It's just here so that I can test in running in SharePoint. And I'll show you the code for doing that shortly, so it's pretty important. So this is what it looks like running in SharePoint. Now let's go in and add this to Teams. So I've already created a Teams manifest. So all I have to do is, and an app, I've uploaded the app. So all I have to do is go in and add the tab. And notice that it says that these settings are automatic in the Teams tab, sorry. So, so you'll see there's the 3 values, and I can just leave them blank. But there's something interesting here, right? If some of these values could not be ascertained from the Teams API, the user could still fill them in here. So this is called the configuration page, and it's part of every tab in Teams that you can have, in addition to your main display, have a page for configuring the tab. SharePoint generated this for me. I didn't have to do it. It knew that I had certain fields that I needed to capture as part of editing the web part, and it just put that web part editing experience over here into the configuration page for me. So it just saved me the work of writing that whole configuration page and the work of saving that configuration, because it's all kept inside the web part store. Now here's our tab, and it works the same inside of Teams, except that for, as I mentioned, I didn't have to tell it what the group ID was or anything like that, because I actually got that from the Teams API. So here's a few reasons why SharePoint Framework in Teams rocks, and I'm just going to kind of build this up over the course of the presentation until I have all 10. But 3 have already become evident from what we've seen here. The first is no need to host the web service or web page. So this can be a big thing in some organizations where IT is siloed, and the people who would allocate space in Azure are different from the modern workplace team that would maintain Teams. So getting rid of that need not only can be a cost saving, but can also help organizationally. We now can reuse our code in Teams and SharePoint. Maybe certain web parts or certain functionality is going to be useful in both products. You only have to write it once. And finally, it's not something that you probably noticed, but I actually got Azure AD single sign-in. So in other words, when I went to that team inside of that tab inside of Teams, I didn't have to log in. I didn't have to mess with security at all. Teams and SharePoint took care of all of it for me. And I can tell you that if I was outside the organization and I didn't have permission, I would not be able to get to that SharePoint site, and I would not be able to view that that application. So security kind of all taken care of for me. And those are the first three big reasons I think that this is really compelling. So now I want to talk a little bit about the Teams Client SDK and show you how we're using it inside the application. The SharePoint framework handles the authentication, as I mentioned, and so some of the things that you would use the Teams Client SDK for are for dealing with authentication inside of your tab. You can pretty much ignore those. But the SDK is still useful for a lot of other things. Now notice in the picture that Teams is running, the blue box. Inside of that is Teams hosted app.aspx. That's the SharePoint page. It's running in an iframe. And the SharePoint Framework web part is JavaScript running inside of that page. So really what it's doing is it's calling the Teams Client SDK is calling out into the Teams shell. So the Microsoft Teams web page or app or the desktop application is actually running in the outside of the iframe. Normally you can't talk from inside the iframe to the outside. This SDK handles the message passing to make that work and allows me to do things like get my context, like what channel am I in, what group am I in, am I running full screen, what language should I be displaying, all this information. Also deep link parameters, so the ability to pass information in via the link to get my context, which I'll show you later in the presentation. I can also get a list of the tab instances owned by the app, and I can handle messages. So a lot of different things here. One thing I'll note is that normally this is the entire, your application would own the entire tab. Here, SharePoint is running inside of that tab. So some of the aspects here, like the entity ID, they're owned by SharePoint. And the sub-entity ID, which is used for the context within your tab, that's for you. So again, I'll show you that when we get into deep linking. So let's take a little look at the code now. And what I'd like to do is just show you the code inside of the Teams client that calls the Teams Client SDK inside the web part and knows magically what team and channel we're talking about. Okay, so here's my environment, and here's the code for this tab. So it's a SharePoint Framework web part. I'll just show you the general structure, right? There's a lot of files here that are configuring the compilers and the gulp, the task runner, and all that kind of stuff. And inside of the source folder is my actual code. And I can have multiple web parts. I only have one here. It's called Field Visit Tab. And if I go into the main code for that web part, Field Visit Tab webpart.ts, you'll see my TypeScript code. Okay, so I'm just going to go down a little bit here, scroll down a little bit. And what you'll see is that one of the methods here is called onInit. So this is a standard part of the SharePoint framework, is that your web part is going to get to do some initialization by overriding the onInit method, and it's going to get to actually render itself by overriding the render method. So let's look at this initialization code for just a minute. So here on line 31, I'm going to actually make a promise. So this is asynchronous code, and if you don't understand it, some of the tutorials should help you. But basically, I can't necessarily initialize myself right now. I might have to go do some long-running operation, which it turns out I actually do have to do here. So that means that onInit returns a promise, and the web part doesn't finish initializing until after I fulfill that promise. So I'm going to go ahead on line 31, make the promise. My default is I'm going to go ahead and resolve the promise immediately, and you'll see how that works in the logic. Now on line 33, I'm going to say if this.context, so this is the SharePoint context, if the SharePoint context includes a member called Microsoft Teams, then that means I'm running in Teams. So at this point, I can actually get my configuration information out of the Teams API. So that's actually an asynchronous call. So I'm gonna redo the promise now, and I'm gonna make a new promise that is not already resolved, and then I'm gonna call Microsoft Teams.getContext. When that returns, just a simple callback here. It's going to call my method, my anonymous method here called with the argument of the context. So this is the actual context. I'm going to squirrel that away in inside of my web part in this .teams context. And I'm also going to grab the group name, the group ID, and the channel ID out of the Teams context while I'm there. And then I'll go ahead and resolve that promise so that the initialization can continue. If, on the other hand, there wasn't a Teams context, then I'm going to fall through to this else condition, and on line 49, I'm actually just going to grab the group name ID and channel ID out of SharePoint properties. So these are the properties that you would edit in the SharePoint property pane, right? And that's it. And so from here on, for instance, down here when I'm setting up, these are all the different services that I'm calling. So some of these, for instance, the document service needs to know, well, that's not, I guess this context isn't an example. Okay, the conversation service needs the group ID and the channel ID. So I'm just going to now pass those in, and this code doesn't really care where they came from, if they came from the property panel in the web part in SharePoint, or if they came from the Teams API, is kind of, works either way, no problem with that. All right, here's where we left off. Okay, so that's been a code walkthrough then of accessing the Teams Client SDK. It's really pretty simple, and it actually adds a few more reasons why SharePoint Framework in Teams rocks. Now you've seen that SharePoint handles the configuration for us. We don't need to write a configuration page, and you can always tell what team and channel you're in by using that Teams SDK. So you have the ability to kind of run inside the context of the team automatically. The next thing I want to talk about is calling some other APIs, namely the Graph API. So as I mentioned, every team runs inside of an Office 365 group. And groups are really the group service is an Azure Active Directory based membership service that allows you to maintain a common set of members that work across multiple applications. Applications like Teams, SharePoint, Stream, Planner, Forms, Outlook, Power BI, OneNote, Dynamics, and Yammer. So lots of different things. You always know there will be an Outlook shared mailbox, and there will always be a SharePoint team site in Teams because those are present in every group. And Teams really depends on the calendar in Exchange in Outlook, and it depends on for its file storage on SharePoint. So those are guaranteed to be there. Guess what? This is a great place to store your application's data. It's easier to find because it's part of the group, so you can get to it through the Graph API once you know the group ID, which you got from the Teams API. The group members will generally have permission to everything inside of the associated objects inside of these applications. So you know that everybody in your group is going to have access to that shared calendar. Everybody in that group is going to have access to that SharePoint site. So you don't have to really worry about permissions. All of these assets are backed up and managed by Office 365. So all the data management tasks, probably don't need to worry about those. The native application has its own user interface. So for maintaining the data or going in and tweaking, loading things, you probably don't need to put all that in your application. You can let people upload or set things up manually inside of that application. And a lot of these applications, including SharePoint, support information protection and compliance features that would be very expensive for you to build into each application. So again, it's another big advantage of storing your data inside of SharePoint lists and libraries, inside of Outlook, and inside of these other services that are already there for users inside of Office 365. Graph API is the common API for all of it. So that's the first thing we're going to talk about. Now, the hardest part of calling the Graph API for sure is authentication. When you go to use the Graph API, you're going to see this little single line of text that says, put your access code here. And you're going to go, what's an access code? Maybe you'll ask that question, or maybe you know. Well, getting that access code, you might as well just tell the developer to fly to the moon. It can be very difficult to get that access code. You have to know what you're doing. You have to call the correct flow, the correct library, and get that access token from Azure Active Directory so that you can securely call the Graph API. So these are some challenges, right? Users want single sign-on with the rest of Teams. I already mentioned SharePoint provides that out of the box. So you're all set for the web page itself. Now, what about that access token? Well, it turns out that SharePoint Framework provides an API that hands you that access token. Actually, it doesn't even hand it to you. It just puts the access token into the API call for you, and you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about renewing it, refreshing it, registering your application, none of it. It's all handled for you by the SharePoint Framework, which saves a ton of headaches and work. Also, you need to register each application and the permission that it's going to need. And again, the SharePoint Framework manages that as well. So I want to show you some more code. And this time, I'm going to show you how to call an external web service. I'm going to show you how to access the SharePoint native API, the Graph API, and also I'll pop into another project that I have to show you how to call a custom web service in Azure that's secured with Azure AD. All right, so if I go back to the application itself, you'll notice that if I come in here, I've got some documents. These are actually, I mentioned these are inside of the SharePoint library, and these photos are inside of a SharePoint images library. Let's go ahead and look at the code that actually pulls that information in. So the way that I've organized this is that each one of those little boxes on the screen is a React component. So this web part is written in React.js. I recommend using React. You don't have to. SharePoint Framework is officially framework agnostic, but there's a lot of things that you get from using React, not the least of which is that SharePoint Framework itself is written in React, so it's already on the page. It's probably going to be faster than loading another framework on top. And there are things, there are reusable components that you can access from Teams and from the Office Graph, from the Office UI Fabric that can be very useful that are also in React. So React is not mandatory, but if you are starting from scratch, you probably want to use React. So here's my documents React component that's going to display that list of documents. Notice that it just gets handed the list of documents. So actually, it's not true. It gets handed a document service, and then it's going to go ahead and call the document service with a customer ID. So remember, right, there's, let's see, the Big Cheese, the BI is their customer ID, right, is the name of the customer, right? And we're going to go ahead and look up the documents for that customer. Each one of the backing services then has a folder down here inside of my solution. And if we look at the first one, that's going to be the document service. Now, this is also smart enough to handle mocking up the data. So I could run this locally if I wanted to, and without being in Teams or anywhere, and just run it in the local SharePoint Framework workbench. And I would get kind of fake mocked up data here. But let's look at the real one. Because what I want to show is that this has a single method called getDocuments. Given a customer ID, it returns an array of iDocument objects. Now it's going to go ahead and get from the SharePoint context the URL of the current website. I know that that's the website that's associated with this team because that's the one that Teams is going to put me on. Now I can go ahead and use that to read in the documents. So here I'm going to say API lists get by title documents. So I'm actually going to look inside the documents, and then I'm going to filter for documents where the customer ID is the one that I specified. So this is just a REST call, and if I kind of come into the SharePoint side of this quickly, I can actually show you those documents. Right, so here they are, and you'll notice that I've got I've actually added a metadata column here for the customer ID. That's the way that it's working. That's the way that filter is working, okay? What's interesting about this code is really what you're not seeing. All I'm doing is calling the SharePoint HTTP client, which is a special API inside of SharePoint Framework, and then I'm constructing the URL for my REST call, and I'm going to make the call. That's it. I noticed that I did not have to obtain an access token or do anything special with the SharePoint to call that SharePoint API. Why? Because the SP HTTP client API is taking care of that for me. Super helpful. Now let's look at the Graph API for a second. The calendar itself is coming from the Graph API. As you might guess, there's a calendar service right here. And if I go into that service, you'll see that I'm actually going to go into the SharePoint framework context now, this.context.msgraph client factory, and I'm going to get the client. That is going to return a promise, so it's an asynchronous call. So when the promise returns, then I get this graph client object handed to me, which I can now use to call the API. So graphclient.api, and I'm just going to say groups/group ID, calendar view, and then I've got the start and end time, and I've chosen to show 1 week. So up on lines 26 and 27, you can see me calculating the start and end time for my query, and then I'm just going to go ahead and make that query on line 32. When that returns, I'm going to get a callback here, which will start on line 35, and I can go in and get those calendar items and start processing them. This is actually trickier if you were to implement this from scratch, because the SharePoint API is just calling the same SharePoint hostname that the page is on. So there's not a lot of fancy authentication, although there is some. There's a thing called a forms digest that it's managing for me. But in this case, the Graph API is at a different DNS name. It's a different host name, which means that the browser's cross-origin rules start to take effect, so that you can't really get to the information very easily about the API that you're calling. I didn't really, I could have worded that more carefully, but it's a cross-origin call, and I need a different access token to call it. All of that is, including the CORS rules and all of the underlying plumbing underneath that makes that work, is being handled by the Graph Client object, and I just don't have to worry about it. Now, my third example, I don't actually have anything in my mashup that shows this, so I'm pulling in a different sample here. This is one that I wrote that actually includes a web service that lists a set of real estate properties. And without going into the whole detail of the web service, I just want to show you again how the SharePoint framework is going to make it easier for me. I've got my Azure AD HTTP client object in this case. So what that allows me to do is to call any Azure AD secured web service that uses the v1 endpoint. So we said a lot there. Okay, Azure AD currently has a v2 endpoint and a v1 endpoint. Could do a whole session just on that. Maybe I will someday. Suffice it to say that the SharePoint framework uses the v1 endpoint. And so this application is accessible to me because it's registered for use with the v1 endpoint. And having done that, I can just go in and grab this HTTP client and then go ahead and make a GET request and get back my data without having to mess with any tokens or anything like that. Now, I did skip over something that's pretty important though, which is the permissions. So remember I said I also, when I registered the applications in Azure AD, which I no longer have to do because SharePoint's doing that for me, I have to request specific permissions. So this up here in the config folder, package solution.json is where that's done. And you'll see here on lines 9 through 14 that I'm actually requesting these permissions. So in this case, the resource is the Real Estate Manager web service, and I'm asking for user impersonation, which is sort of the most basic access. If I go back to my code from the big mashup demo, I can show you the same thing is going on for the Graph API. So I had to have calendars.read, and then I had to have group.readwrite.all permission in order to post into the channel. I requested those permissions, and then what happens is that inside, when I upload my application to SharePoint, it's actually going to go ahead and handle that for me. So let me go to the new admin center. So this is the new and exciting SharePoint Admin Center, and inside of here is a section called API Management. And what you can see here is that every application that I've installed, all my SharePoint Framework packages that needed a permission, they're here. And this is partly because SharePoint needs to know about them, because I might actually use more than one of these on a page at the same time if I was in SharePoint, where you could have more than one web part, right? Suffice to say that I don't need to touch Azure AD. All I need to do is click one of these and then approve or reject it from right inside of here. And the SharePoint framework is going to take care of that for me. So this brings us to some more reasons why I love SharePoint Framework in Teams. Easy access to the Graph and SharePoint APIs, much easier than doing it by hand. The ability to store my data in the Office 365 group by virtue of those APIs. I don't need to maintain a database or anything like that in many cases. In my case, I'm just storing the data right inside of a shared calendar and inside of a SharePoint document library. And then I can manage my application centrally in the SharePoint Admin Center. So 3 more reasons why I really like this. So the next thing I want to talk about is connecting with the conversation. So one of the great things about Microsoft Teams is that you can work in context, and you sort of have the ability to collaborate and have a conversation at the same time as you're doing other work with your team. A classic example might be editing a document. Having a conversation about the document while you're co-authoring is a really powerful experience. Well, suppose I want to do that inside of my application and my custom application. There are a few different ways that I can get data into, or basically postings into the conversation. One is with the Graph API. I could also use a bot. I could also use a connector. And then maybe I want to maintain context using deep links. So I'll show you what I mean. Here's my sample again. And I'm now looking at a particular meeting. Let's go back to this big cheese one. And you'll see there's a certain amount of context here on the screen. It's got my name highlighted, and I'm also in the context of the big cheese fire damage assessment. So we have this little box over here where I can actually type a message to my team and click send. What that's going to do is it's going to use the Graph API to post a message right into the channel where I say, hey team, I need a little bit of help here. And the big cheese is the name of my customer. Guess what? That's a deep link. So if anybody goes and clicks on that, maybe they want to know what's going on over at that particular client. They click the button, my tab opens up, and it doesn't just go to the beginning, it goes exactly to that particular engagement, that particular customer and particular user that was already selected. So that's kind of the idea here, is to be able to kind of keep that context in both directions, and what we call working in the open. So now let me show you the code behind that, where I will post to the Graph API and construct the deep link that brings us back into a particular context. So if you figured out my my sort of design here, you won't be surprised to learn that there is a service for this. So the conversation service is one that I wrote that does the Graph API call to post into the channel. And that's the mock. Here's the real one. So you'll see what we're going to do is we get fed the context, the SharePoint context, service scope, team ID, and channel ID by the web part. And then I have a single method that I'm going to expose called create chat thread, in which I take the string that the user typed and the type of content, which is actually allows me to with the content type specifies whether I'm talking about HTML or text, and that's actually just part of the API. So inside of the code, I'm going to go ahead and construct a little piece of JSON for my new message, and then I'm going to go ahead and call the Graph API and post that message into the channel. And you can see that the Graph wants to know the team ID and the channel ID / chat threads, and then I'm going to go ahead and post that message into there. So it's that easy to post something into the channel from the SharePoint framework, where you've already got this Graph client here waiting to help you. Now let's look at where that actual message came from. That's up here in my UI, where I've got the post channel React component, and this shows the text area where I typed in the little input box. The input button, I mean. What's interesting about this is constructing the deep link. So the link that got us back, right? Here's the deep link. So it always starts the same, teams.microsoft.com/L/entity. Then I need to give it the Teams application ID. It's the same app ID that went into the Teams manifest, so that Teams knows what we're talking about. The entity ID in this case belongs to SharePoint. So if you were writing your own tab from scratch, you would own both the entity ID and the sub-entity ID. Well, this time SharePoint's in the picture. So SharePoint is going to actually specify the entity ID. We just have to pass it in via the deep link. Basically, this ends up telling Teams which tab it is that we want to go to. Okay? Then I get to pass in a few other values, including the context, which includes my sub-entity ID. So the sub-entity ID is for us SharePoint Framework developers, right? This is where, okay, Teams got me to the right tab, but I want to select a particular customer and user on the screen, right? So what I'm going to do is go ahead and pass the selected user and customer into the context here and pass that in along with the channel ID. So the URL ends up kind of being a long one with this little piece of JSON right inside the URL. All right, then it turns out that because I'm posting HTML, I can actually construct the little div that you saw on the screen, right? This little, let me go back to it. We're building this little div right here with the big cheese on it, right? So it constructs that, injects the URL as a hyperlink, and we're off to the races. And it calls the service and actually posts it. So, pretty straightforward in the end, and hugely powerful because it allows you to bring the conversation right in to your tab and vice versa. So that adds another thing that I like about this, which is the deep linking, allowing me to pass the context all the way through SharePoint down into my code. The last thing that I want to talk about is another top reason why SharePoint Framework and Teams rocks, and that is the SharePoint community. A lot of people from the SharePoint community are getting into Teams because it solves a lot of the same problems as a Teams site used to, but now, of course, you get a lot more capability in Teams, and the Teams site is still there. So this is really attracting a lot of customers and partners who have traditionally worked with SharePoint. all of that SharePoint love, all of the assets that are available for a SharePoint developer now all of a sudden become relevant to a Teams developer who's using SharePoint Framework. Um, there are huge conferences. There are conferences all over the world on SharePoint all the time. The next big one is the SharePoint Conference North America coming up in Las Vegas this May. But there are tons of other regional conferences, SharePoint Fest, SP TechCon. There are all around the world, actually. Below that, you'll see a screen from SPS events. So SPS stands for SharePoint Saturday. Hundreds of volunteers around the world put these free SharePoint Saturday events on. And you can see here the calendars might be out of date as you're watching this, but you can see here that almost every weekend there's one or more events going on somewhere. So you can go and learn from the experts everything that you need to know about SharePoint. There are almost always sessions on SharePoint development. Upper middle, I've got a screenshot of the SharePoint GitHub repo, where there are tons of tutorials and open source samples, reusable code, pieces of solutions that are there for you to use. There are tutorials, so center middle screenshot is of the tutorials for getting started with the SharePoint framework. I've got that linked a little bit later, or on that big slide with all the links. SharePoint developer community is very rich. It's connected with the SharePoint Patterns and Practices team, and they have regular community webcasts in which you can stay up to date on all the latest. And really, I'm just scratching the surface. This is such a rich community, I can't tell you. And then Teams is rapidly catching up, or actually just sort of becoming part of the same happy family, I would say. Here's the actual Teams developer landing page where you can get to all the assets that I've shown you, as well as a lot more for working with Teams. So the community is a really big part of the value here in integrating in with SharePoint. So that's basically what I wanted to say and show you today. Here's the resources once again. If you want to get started with all of this, I would say, look at the tooling up list, see if you find that you really want to learn TypeScript. You probably need to learn TypeScript. So there's some assets on that. Some of the others you don't need to know quite as much about, but you still should have some level of familiarity. And then dig into the tutorials on the right side. The SharePoint Framework Dev Setup, first web part, probably where you want to start. Then you might want to skip to the Teams application development walkthrough, and that'll get you going on putting a web part into Teams. From there, you could grab my code from this webinar and just come in. If you download the repo, you can just type npm install to bring down all of the node packages that are needed, and then go ahead and run it just like the web parts from the walkthrough. It's just a web part. It's pretty much self-contained. Here are some other resources that are common to the entire webinar series, including Teamwork Solution Accelerator, Workshop, Developer Center, and other documentation. So a ton of assets here for you to dig into. So my call to action is start using Teams today. If you're watching this and you are only an occasional user of Microsoft Teams, I encourage you to just start using it every day and start to understand the gestalt of what it is, the value that it brings to users, and what users are going to expect when they go to use it. Then dig into the rest of this webinar series, play with the hands-on labs, and join the Teamwork Solution Accelerator for partners if you are a managed partner. So thank you so much. I hope this webinar has been of value to you, and I look forward to hearing from people in the future.